A wounded veteran returned home with nothing but a limp, a handful of medals, and 40 acres of land everyone called worthless. But buried beneath that forgotten soil was a secret worth $295 million, and it was about to change everything. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The bus pulled into the station at 6:47 in the morning, right when the fog was thickest over the hills of Millers Creek, West Virginia. Marcus Cole stepped off last, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his left leg dragging just slightly behind the right. He didn't want anyone to notice the limp, but after 18 months of physical therapy and 2 surgeries that never quite fixed what the explosion had broken, hiding it was like trying to hide the sun behind your thumb. The station wasn't much. A concrete platform, a rusted bench, and a ticket window that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Reagan administration. Marcus stood there for a long moment, breathing in air that smelled like wet pine and coal dust and something else, something that reminded him of childhood in a way that made his chest ache. He was 34 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart, a medical discharge, and now, standing in the town he swore he'd never come back to, he had exactly $412 in his checking account, a disability check that would hit in 9 days, and nowhere else on earth to go. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent a decade running from Millers Creek, from the poverty and the gossip and the slow death of a place that time had forgotten. He'd joined the army at 19, determined to become someone, to matter, to escape. And now here he was, dragged back by gravity and grief and the simple fact that when everything else falls apart, you go home. Even when home is just a ghost of what it used to be. Marcus started walking. There were no taxis in Millers Creek, no Uber drivers waiting with their phones glowing. There was just the road, cracked and winding, leading up into the hills where his grandfather's land sat untouched and overgrown and waiting. His mother had died while he was deployed. Pneumonia, they said, though Marcus suspected it was something slower, something that had been eating at her for years, loneliness maybe, or the quiet suffocation of watching everyone she loved leave or fade away. He'd gotten the Red Cross message in Kandahar, stood in the communications tent with his hands shaking, and realized he couldn't even make it home for the funeral. The timing was wrong. The mission was active. His commanding officer had looked at him with something like pity and said, "I'm sorry, Sergeant, we need you here." So he stayed. He fought. He watched 3 of his brothers die in a flash of light and thunder that still woke him up at 2 in the morning, gasping for air, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. And now his mother was in the ground next to his father, who'd died when Marcus was 15. Black lung from the mines that had swallowed half the men in this county. And the only thing left of his family was 40 acres of rocky, useless land and a cabin that probably didn't even have running water anymore. Welcome home, soldier. The walk took nearly 2 hours. By the time Marcus reached the property line, the fog had burned off and the sun was cutting through the trees in long golden shafts. He stopped at the old mailbox, rusted and leaning, the name Cole barely visible beneath years of weather and neglect. The driveway, if you could call it that, was more weeds than gravel now. Marcus pushed through, his bad leg protesting with every step, until the cabin came into view. It was smaller than he remembered. The porch sagged on one side. The windows were clouded with grime. The roof had patches of moss growing thick and green, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly, like it was tired of standing and just wanted to lie down. But it was still there. After everything, it was still there. Marcus climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each one before putting his full weight down. The front door was unlocked. No one locked their doors out here, not because it was safe, but because there was nothing worth stealing. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Dust and mildew and something animal, probably mice or raccoons that had made themselves at home over the years. The furniture was covered in sheets, grey with age. The kitchen sink had a brown stain running down from the faucet. The floorboards creaked with every step, and somewhere in the walls something skittered away from the sound. Marcus set his duffel bag on the table and looked around. This was it. This was everything he had now. He didn't cry. He'd stopped crying somewhere between his third surgery and his mother's death, like the part of him that produced tears had simply dried up and blown away. But he felt something shift in his chest, something heavy and cold settling into place. He'd survived the war. Now he had to survive this. The first week was about making the cabin livable. Marcus worked from sunrise to sunset, cleaning and patching and jerry-rigging solutions to problems that should have required professionals and money he didn't have. He got the water running, brown at first, then gradually clearer. He patched the holes in the roof with plastic sheeting and prayer. He swept out the mice nests and set traps and burned the old mattress in the yard because it was more mold than fabric. He didn't go into town. He wasn't ready for that yet. Wasn't ready for the stares, the questions, the awkward thank yous from people who didn't know what to say to a man who'd come back broken from a war they'd only seen on television. Instead, he lived on canned food he'd brought with him and water from the well his grandfather had dug decades ago. He slept on the floor in a sleeping bag rated for -20 degrees, which was overkill for West Virginia in September, but it was what he had. And every night he lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, owls and coyotes and wind through the trees, and tried not to think about the sounds that still echoed in his head, the explosion, the screaming, the silence that came after, worse than any noise. Rodriguez, 23 years old, engaged to his high school sweetheart, gone. Thompson, 27, father of twins he'd never met, gone. Diaz, 31, the squad's comedian who could make anyone laugh even in the worst moments, gone. Marcus, 34, still here, still breathing, still wondering why. Survivor's guilt, the army psychiatrist had called it. Completely normal after traumatic loss. It'll get better with time and therapy. Marcus had nodded along because that's what you did. You nodded and you agreed and you went through the motions. But deep down, he knew the truth. Some wounds didn't heal. Some wounds just became part of you, scar tissue wrapped around your soul. On the 8th day, someone came. Marcus was on the porch, sanding down a plank that had started to splinter, when he heard the car coming up the drive. He tensed immediately, years of training kicking in, his hand moving toward his hip before he remembered he wasn't carrying anymore. The vehicle that emerged from the trees was a county sheriff's cruiser, white and brown, with a light bar on top that hadn't been turned on. It rolled to a stop about 20 feet from the cabin, and the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was about Marcus's age, maybe a year or two younger. He wore the tan uniform of a deputy, a badge glinting on his chest, and he had the kind of face that looked like it smiled a lot, even when things weren't funny. Marcus recognized him immediately. "Daniel Larson," he said, not quite a question. The deputy grinned. "Marcus Cole, heard you were back, had to see it for myself." They'd been friends once, back in high school, back when Marcus still believed he might have a future in this town. Daniel had been the quarterback, Marcus the running back. They'd won exactly 4 games in 2 seasons, but they'd had fun doing it. Then Marcus had enlisted, and Daniel had stayed, and the years had piled up between them like snow. Now here they were, one in uniform, one in worn jeans and a t-shirt that was more holes than fabric. "You look good," Daniel said, which was a lie but a kind one. "How you holding up?" Marcus shrugged. "Still vertical." "That's something." Daniel looked around at the property, taking in the overgrown fields, the leaning cabin, the general air of neglect. "Place hasn't changed much." "It's changed plenty, just not for the better." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that old friends could share without it being awkward. A crow called from somewhere in the pines. The wind rustled through the leaves. "I was sorry to hear about your mom," Daniel said finally. "She was a good woman." Yeah. Marcus didn't know what else to say. She was. And I'm sorry about everything else. Daniel gestured vaguely, but Marcus knew what he meant. The injury, the discharge, the end of a career that was supposed to be his whole identity. The guys at the station wanted me to thank you for your service. They're good people. Bit awkward maybe, but they mean well. Marcus nodded. He'd heard that phrase so many times it had lost all meaning. Thank you for your service, like it was something to be proud of, like he hadn't spent 10 years watching good men die for reasons that got harder to remember with every passing day. You need anything, Daniel continued. You let me know. Groceries, supplies, whatever. I'm here to help. Appreciate it. I mean it, Marcus. Daniel's voice was serious now, the playfulness gone. I know this town ain't much. I know people talk, and most of them don't know what to say to someone who's been where you've been. But you're not alone out here, okay? Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. I'll keep that in mind. Daniel nodded, satisfied. I'll check on you in a few days. Try not to become a hermit before then. He drove off, the cruiser disappearing back into the trees, and Marcus was alone again. But something had shifted. Some small part of the weight on his chest had eased. It wasn't much, but it was something. The days bled together after that. Marcus fell into a rhythm that was part therapy, part survival. He woke at dawn, made coffee on the ancient propane stove, and worked until his body forced him to stop. He cleared brush. He patched fences. He dug out the old vegetable garden his grandmother had kept, and stood there staring at the dirt, wondering if he remembered anything about growing food. The work was hard on his leg, but that was part of the point. The pain gave him something to focus on, something real and immediate that drowned out the noise in his head. When he was swinging a machete at overgrown brambles, he couldn't think about the past. When he was hauling rotted fence posts out of the ground, he couldn't remember the faces of the men he'd lost. Or at least, he could pretend he couldn't. The land itself was bigger than he'd remembered. 40 acres of rocky, rolling terrain that butted up against the base of Miller's Ridge, a long spine of mountain that ran north to south through the county. Most of the property was forest, oak and pine and maple, thick with undergrowth that hadn't been managed in years. But there were clearings too, patches of meadow where wildflowers grew and deer grazed in the early morning light. His grandfather had bought this land back in 1953, right after coming home from Korea. Marcus's mother had told him stories, how Samuel Cole had paid cash, how he'd refused to sell even when the coal companies came sniffing around, how he'd spent his whole life protecting these 40 acres like they were sacred ground. Marcus had never understood why. The land wasn't good for farming. There was no coal underneath it, despite what the companies had hoped. It was just rocks and trees and silence, the kind of place where a man could disappear if he wanted to. Maybe that was the point. It was on the 14th day that Marcus found it. He'd been working his way along the eastern edge of the property, cutting back decades of growth from a section near the base of the ridge. This area was different from the rest, rockier, steeper, with outcroppings of grey stone pushing up through the soil like bones through skin. Marcus remembered coming here as a kid, back when his grandfather was still alive. Samuel had always kept this section off limits, claiming it was too dangerous for a boy to play near. "Rocks'll slide," he'd said. "Break your fool neck." Marcus had believed him then. Now, as an adult, he recognized the warning for what it was, a man protecting a secret. He pushed through a tangle of wild blackberry bushes, thorns catching on his clothes, and stopped. There, half buried under years of fallen leaves and creeping vines, was a shape that didn't belong. Marcus dropped to his knees, ignoring the protest from his injured leg, and began clearing away the debris. His heart was pounding, though he couldn't have said why. Something in his gut was screaming at him, some instinct honed by years of combat telling him this was important. The shape became clearer as he worked. Metal, rusted but solid. A handle, circular, like something you'd see on a submarine hatch. Marcus sat back on his heels, breathing hard. What the hell? He pulled out his phone. No signal, as usual this far from town, and then remembered his grandfather's toolbox, still sitting in the cabin where it had been for as long as Marcus could remember. He'd gone through it once, looking for basic tools, but hadn't paid much attention to the contents. Now he ran back to the cabin, bad legs screaming, and dug through the box until his fingers closed around something unexpected. A ring of keys, old and heavy, made of brass. There were 6 keys on the ring. Marcus had no idea what any of them were for. The cabin's doors didn't need keys. They had simple latches. There was no lock on the property that he'd encountered. Until now. He ran back to the site, keys clutched in his fist, and knelt before the hidden hatch. Up close, he could see it was set into concrete, a slab poured deliberately into the rocky ground, then camouflaged with decades of natural overgrowth. Whoever had built this hadn't wanted it found. The lock was old, crusted with dirt and oxidation, but when Marcus tried the 3rd key on the ring, something clicked. The mechanism turned, he grabbed the handle and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. The hatch had been sealed for years, maybe decades, and the elements had welded it shut. Marcus pulled harder, putting his back into it, and with a groan of metal against concrete, the hatch swung open. Stale air rushed out, cold and dry, carrying a smell that was somehow both ancient and preserved. Marcus peered down into the darkness. Stone steps carved into the rock descended into nothing. His flashlight was back at the cabin. He should go get it. He should be careful, methodical, smart. Instead, he took out his phone, activated the flashlight function, and started down. The steps were narrow and steep, carved directly into the bedrock. Marcus counted as he descended, 10, 20, 30 steps, his phone's weak light barely illuminating the walls around him. The stone was grey and smooth, almost polished, like it had been cut by someone who knew what they were doing. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a corridor. Concrete walls reinforced with steel beams that had somehow resisted rust despite the years. Cables ran along the ceiling, thick and industrial, leading somewhere deeper into the earth. Marcus followed them. The corridor stretched for maybe 100 feet before opening into a larger space. Marcus stepped through and stopped dead. He was standing in a room that shouldn't exist. It was huge, at least 50 feet across, with ceilings that arched overhead like a cathedral. The walls were lined with equipment, metal shelving, communications consoles, banks of switches and dials that looked like something out of a 1960s spy movie. Emergency lights flickered to life as he moved forward, activated by some sensor he couldn't see. The soft red glow revealed more details. Bunk beds along one wall, a small kitchen station, storage lockers labeled in military stencil. This was a bunker, a Cold War bunker built into the mountain, hidden from the world, and it was on his grandfather's land. Marcus moved through the space in a daze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The equipment was old but maintained. Someone had been down here, keeping it running, checking on it regularly. The air was dry, climate-controlled, preserved. At the far end of the main room, a steel door stood closed. Unlike the others he'd passed, this one had a serious lock, a combination dial, military grade, the kind you saw on bank vaults. Marcus tried the brass keys, knowing they wouldn't work. They didn't. This lock was different, more secure. He searched the space, opening lockers and checking drawers, until he found what he was looking for, a small notebook, tucked behind a stack of field manuals, filled with his grandfather's handwriting. The combination was on the 3rd page, underlined twice. Marcus returned to the vault door and entered the numbers, 47, 12, 39, 8. The lock clicked, the door swung inward on silent hinges, and Marcus Cole, injured veteran with nothing to his name, stepped into a room filled with more wealth than he'd ever imagined possible. The stone vault, and it was a vault carved directly into the mountain's bedrock, was lined with rows of metal shelving that stretched from floor to ceiling. On those shelves sat wooden crates, their lids sealed but their contents visible through gaps in the slats. Gold, bars of it, stacked neatly, gleaming in the dim light. Marcus moved forward like a man in a dream. He reached out and touched one of the bars, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage. But it was real, cool and heavy and undeniably, impossibly real. He opened another crate. Currency, stacks of bills, but not American. German marks, Swiss francs, British pounds, all old, all preserved, all worth God knew what to collectors. Another crate held smaller boxes, velvet-lined, filled with diamonds that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows. And another held platinum coins, sealed in tubes, labeled with dates that stretched back to the 1940s. Marcus sank to his knees in the center of the vault, his breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. He was a man who'd been counting his last few $100s, who'd been surviving on canned soup and desperation, and now he was kneeling in front of a fortune that defied comprehension. On a wooden desk at the back of the vault, a leather-bound ledger sat waiting. Marcus rose on shaking legs and approached it. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed, but the handwriting inside was crisp and careful. His grandfather's handwriting. The ledger was a record. Every item in the vault was catalogued: acquisition date, origin, condition, estimated value. The entries stretched back decades, starting in 1949 and continuing until just a few years ago, right around the time Samuel Cole had passed away. Marcus flipped to the final page. There, in the same careful script, was a number that made his vision blur. Total estimated value as of January 2020, $295 million. Beneath it, a note: for Marcus when he's ready. Marcus closed the ledger and looked around the vault, at the gold, the currency, the diamonds, the platinum, at the impossible fortune that had been sitting beneath his feet, beneath worthless land that everyone in town had laughed about for his entire life. And then he saw the letter. It was tucked into an envelope taped to the inside cover of the ledger, sealed with wax, his name written on the front in his grandfather's hand. Marcus's fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the same careful script. My dear Marcus, if you're reading this, then I've gone on to whatever comes next, and you've found what I've spent my life protecting. I imagine you have questions. I wish I could answer them in person, but time ran out before I could tell you everything. I was not always just a farmer and a veteran. During the war, the second one, and the years that followed, I served my country in ways that were never written in any official record. I was part of a unit tasked with recovering assets that the Nazis had stolen: gold from banks, art from museums, treasures from families who were murdered for their faith. Most of what we recovered went where it was supposed to go, but some of it was marked for destruction. The government decided it was too complicated, too political, too dangerous to return. They ordered us to destroy it rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. I couldn't do it. I saw what that gold was. Blood money, yes, but also legacy, memory. The last physical trace of people who had been erased from history. I couldn't melt it down and pretend it never existed, so I hid it. I bought this land with money I'd saved from the war, and I built this bunker with my own hands, and I spent the next 60 years protecting it, waiting for the right person to inherit it. That person is you. I watched you grow up, Marcus. I watched you become a man of honor, even when honor was hard to come by. I watched you choose service over comfort, duty over ease. And I knew from the time you were a boy that you were the one I was waiting for. This fortune is yours now. But it comes with a burden. There are people who would kill to possess it. There are secrets here that could destroy lives if they fell into the wrong hands. You must be careful. You must be wise. But more than that, you must use it for good. I could never decide what that meant. I spent decades wrestling with the question and never found an answer. Maybe you'll do better than I did. Maybe you'll find a way to turn blood money into something pure. Whatever you decide, know this: I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you, and I believe in you, even from beyond the grave. Your grandfather, Samuel. Marcus read the letter 3 times, then he folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and sat in the silence of the vault for a long, long time. Outside, the world continued on. The sun set over Miller's Ridge. The owls began their nightly calls. Somewhere in town, people were going about their lives, unaware that everything had changed. But down here, in the stone heart of the mountain, a wounded veteran sat among a fortune that had been waiting for him his entire life. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to feel. The weight of it was crushing, suffocating, too big to fit inside his chest. But somewhere beneath the shock and the fear and the overwhelming impossibility of it all, something else was stirring. Something that felt almost like hope. His grandfather had believed in him, had chosen him, had trusted him with this burden, this gift, this responsibility. Maybe that meant something. Maybe that meant he wasn't as broken as he thought. Marcus stood, his bad leg aching, his eyes burning. He took one last look around the vault, at the gold, the diamonds, the decades of secrets waiting to be understood, and then he turned and walked back toward the stairs. Behind him, the emergency lights hummed softly. Above him, 40 acres of worthless land stretched toward the stars, and ahead of him, a future he'd never imagined was waiting to be born. Marcus climbed the stone steps slowly, his mind churning with thoughts that refused to form into coherent shape. The brass keys were clutched in his fist so tightly that the metal bit into his palm, leaving marks that would last for hours. When he emerged from the hatch, the night air hit him like a wave. Cool, clean, real. He stood there for a moment, breathing it in, trying to convince himself that he hadn't just hallucinated the entire thing. But the hatch was still open at his feet. The stale air of the bunker still drifted up from below, and the weight of his grandfather's letter still pressed against his chest, folded into his shirt pocket like a second heartbeat. $295 million. The number refused to make sense. Marcus had grown up poor. He'd lived on military pay that was decent but never luxurious. He'd learned to stretch dollars until they screamed, to find value in things other people threw away, to measure wealth in meals rather than bank accounts. And now, suddenly, impossibly, he was rich beyond anything he'd ever dreamed. Except he wasn't. Not really, because that money wasn't just sitting in a bank account waiting to be spent. It was hidden treasure, stolen treasure, if his grandfather's letter was to be believed. It was gold that governments had wanted destroyed, currency that no longer circulated, diamonds that had no legitimate provenance. This wasn't a lottery win, it was a landmine. Marcus closed the hatch, piling leaves and debris over it until it was hidden again. His hands moved automatically, military training kicking in, the instinct to camouflage and conceal taking over, while his conscious mind was still reeling. Then he walked back to the cabin on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on his sleeping bag on the hard floor, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move as clouds passed across the moon. His grandfather's face kept appearing in his mind, Samuel Cole, who had seemed like just a quiet farmer, a veteran who kept to himself, a man who tended his land and minded his business. A man who had been hiding one of the largest private fortunes in American history. How had no one known? How had Samuel kept this secret for 60 years? How had he built a bunker in the mountain without anyone noticing? The answers were there, Marcus realized, in the ledger and the documents he'd only glanced at. This wasn't a mystery. It was a story waiting to be read. He just had to be brave enough to read it, or smart enough to walk away. That thought came unbidden, and it surprised him. Walk away. Pretend he'd never found it. Seal the hatch, forget the keys, live out his days in the crumbling cabin, and die without ever touching the fortune beneath his feet. It was possible. It was even, in some ways, appealing. Because what did he know about $295 million? What did he know about gold and diamonds and secrets that governments had tried to bury? He was just a soldier, just a mechanic's son from a dying coal town. He fixed things with his hands and followed orders and tried not to think too hard about the big picture. But even as the thought formed, he knew he couldn't do it, couldn't walk away. Not after reading his grandfather's letter, not after seeing the trust in those carefully written words. You must use it for good. What did that mean? What could it possibly mean? Marcus closed his eyes and saw, unbidden, the faces of his fallen brothers. Rodriguez with his shy smile, Thompson with his pictures of daughters he'd never held, Diaz with his ridiculous jokes that somehow made the worst days bearable. They'd died in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map, fighting a war that most Americans had stopped paying attention to. They'd given everything, and in return, the world had given them folded flags and forgotten names, and they weren't alone. Marcus had seen it in the years since his discharge. He'd seen veterans sleeping under bridges, veterans begging for change outside gas stations, veterans drowning in bottles and pills and the slow poison of neglect. The government thanked them for their service and then looked the other way. What if there was another option? The thought was fragile, barely formed, but it lodged in Marcus's chest like a shard of light. What if the blood money could become something else? What if the fortune stolen from the dead could be used to save the living? Marcus opened his eyes. The ceiling was still there, the shadows were still moving. Nothing had changed, except everything had. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of an engine. He was on his feet before he was fully conscious, instincts taking over, hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The sunlight streaming through the dirty windows told him he'd slept longer than he'd meant to. It was past 8, maybe closer to 9. The engine sound grew louder, closer, then stopped. A car door slammed. Footsteps on the porch. A knock. Marcus's heart was hammering as he moved to the window, peering out through the grimy glass. The cruiser was back. Daniel Larson was standing on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, looking around with the casual curiosity of a man who had nothing to hide. Marcus forced himself to breathe, forced his hands to unclench, forced his face into something that might pass for normal. He opened the door. "Morning, soldier," Daniel said with a grin. "Brought you some real coffee. Figured you might be tired of whatever instant swamp water you've been drinking." Marcus took the cup, the warmth seeping into his fingers. "Thanks." Daniel studied him for a moment, the grin fading slightly. "You okay? You look like you didn't sleep." "Nightmares," Marcus said, which was true enough. "They come and go." Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't push. That was one of the things Marcus had always appreciated about him. He knew when to ask and when to leave alone. "Mind if I come in?" Marcus hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then he stepped aside. The cabin looked worse in the morning light, all its floors exposed by the sun. Daniel looked around, taking in the bare floors, the patched roof, the general air of desperate repair. "You've been busy," he said. "Keeps me sane." "I hear that." Daniel sat down at the kitchen table, the only furniture that was still usable. Marcus sat across from him, the coffee cup cradled in his hands like a lifeline. For a few minutes they just sat in silence, drinking coffee, listening to the birds outside. It was almost peaceful, almost normal. Then Daniel said, "I need to tell you something." Marcus looked up. The deputy's face had gone serious, the easy smile replaced by something harder. "There's a man in town," Daniel continued. "Name's Preston Cole. No relation to you, far as I know. He's been buying up land around here. Says he's working for some pipeline company, looking to run a line through the county." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And?" And he's been asking about your grandfather's property. Daniel met his eyes. Specifically this property. He stopped by the station yesterday, wanting to know who owned it now. I didn't tell him much, but he's not stupid. He'll figure out you're back. What does he want with this land? There's nothing here. No coal, no gas, nothing worth a damn. I don't know. Daniel shook his head. But he offered the Hendersons $20,000 for their 40 acres, and they've got even less than you do. Something about this doesn't add up. Marcus said nothing. His mind was racing, calculating, trying to figure out how much this stranger might know. Just watch yourself, Daniel said, standing up. This Cole guy, he's got money and lawyers and that look in his eye like he's used to getting what he wants. Don't let him pressure you into anything. I won't. Daniel paused at the door. And Marcus, whatever you're dealing with, you don't have to deal with it alone, okay? Marcus looked at him, at the badge, the uniform, the genuine concern in his old friend's eyes, and felt the weight of his secret pressing down like a physical force. Okay, he said. But even as the word left his mouth, he knew it was a lie. This secret was too big, too dangerous, too impossible to share. He was alone in this, and somewhere in town, a man named Preston Cole was already looking for answers. Marcus stood on the porch and watched the cruiser disappear down the drive. The coffee had gone cold in his hands, but he didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities, calculating risks. Someone was interested in this land. Someone was asking questions, and beneath his feet, buried in stone and silence, $295 million waited for him to decide its fate. Marcus looked up at the sky, blue and clear and indifferent to the chaos churning inside him. Then he turned and walked back into the cabin. He had work to do. The next several days passed in a blur of careful activity. Marcus returned to the bunker multiple times, each visit revealing new layers of his grandfather's secret. He found the documents first, stacks of them, organized in filing cabinets that lined one wall of the main chamber. Operation Recovery files, stamped classified, detailing missions that had never appeared in any history book. Names of agents, many of them crossed out with dates of death beside them. Maps of locations across Europe where Nazi loot had been hidden and retrieved. His grandfather's service record was there too, not the official one, the real one. The one that showed Samuel Cole had been far more than a simple infantry sergeant. He'd been part of a covert unit, handpicked for intelligence and discretion, tasked with recovering assets that the world was never supposed to know existed. Marcus read through the files with growing amazement. The scope of what his grandfather had been involved in was staggering. Billions of dollars in gold, art, and currency had passed through his unit's hands. Most of it had been returned to its rightful owners or handed over to governments, but some of it, a significant portion, had simply vanished. Or rather, it had been ordered destroyed. The memos were there too. Directives from high-ranking officials demanding that certain assets be melted down, burned, eliminated. The reasons varied. Too politically sensitive, impossible to verify ownership, potentially embarrassing to Allied governments. But in every case, the real reason was the same. Someone, somewhere, had decided these treasures were more trouble than they were worth, and Samuel Cole had refused to comply. The bunker itself was a marvel of engineering. Marcus found schematics that showed how his grandfather had built it, slowly, carefully, over a period of 15 years. He'd quarried the stone himself, poured the concrete in sections, installed the electrical systems piece by piece. The ventilation came from natural fissures in the rock, carefully channeled and filtered. The power came from a small generator buried even deeper in the mountain, connected to a fuel reserve that had been topped off regularly for decades. It was a life's work, a monument to paranoia and preservation, and now it belonged to Marcus. On the 5th day, he found the other documents, the ones that made his blood run cold. They were in a separate folder, locked in a fireproof safe behind the main desk. The combination was in his grandfather's notebook, like everything else. Inside were names, 12 of them, written in his grandfather's hand, each one followed by a brief description. Generals, senators, intelligence officials, men who had risen to power in the decades since the war, men whose names Marcus recognized from history books and news programs. And beside each name was a damning detail, a connection to the assets that should have been destroyed, a payment received, a favor granted, a secret kept. These men had known about the hidden fortune. Some of them had profited from it. And all of them, Marcus realized with growing horror, had reason to want it to stay hidden. His grandfather's final note was at the bottom of the folder, written in a hand that shook with age or fear or both. These men killed for less. If they learn you have this, they will come for you. Trust no one, protect yourself, and when the time is right, let the truth be known. Marcus sat in the vault for a long time after reading those words. The fortune was still there, gleaming and silent. The gold bars, the diamonds, the platinum coins. But now he saw them differently. This wasn't just money. It was evidence, leverage, a weapon that could destroy powerful people or get him killed. And somewhere out there, someone named Preston Cole was already circling. Marcus closed the folder and returned it to the safe. He locked the vault door behind him and climbed the stone steps into the fading light of another West Virginia evening. The stars were coming out one by one above the trees. He stood there for a long moment, breathing the cool air, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps in the cabin. Someone was already here. The fire department cleared out around 2 a.m. The damage wasn't as bad as it could have been. One wall scorched, the window shattered, some smoke damage to the interior. But the message was clear. Someone wanted Marcus gone, and they weren't afraid to escalate. Daniel insisted on staying the rest of the night, parking his cruiser at the end of the driveway with a thermos of coffee and a shotgun across his lap. Marcus didn't argue. For the first time since coming home, he was grateful not to be alone. But he didn't sleep either. He sat in the cabin's only intact chair, watching the shadows move across the walls, thinking about Preston Cole and his expensive suit and his predator's smile. Be careful out here. These hills can be dangerous for a man alone. The words echoed in Marcus's mind like a threat wrapped in silk. Cole knew something, maybe not everything, maybe not about the vault or the gold or the $295 million sitting beneath the mountain, but something. He was circling too close, pushing too hard for this to be about a simple land deal, which meant Marcus had a choice to make. He could run, take whatever cash he could liquidate from the vault, disappear somewhere far away, start over under a new name. He had the skills for it. The army had trained him to survive in hostile territory, and what was civilian life if not one long hostile territory? But running meant abandoning everything. The land his grandfather had protected for 60 years, the fortune that could help thousands of people, the truth that powerful men had killed to keep buried. And it meant proving every voice in his head right, the ones that whispered he was broken, worthless, a survivor who should have died with his brothers. No. Marcus had spent too long running from himself. He wasn't going to run from this. The sun rose slowly over Miller's Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Marcus watched it through the smoke-stained window, feeling something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, something harder. Resolve. He was going to fight, and he was going to win. The first step was understanding what he was fighting against. Over the next week, Marcus threw himself into research with the same intensity he'd once brought to combat missions. He drove to the county library in Wheeling, spending hours hunched over ancient computer terminals, searching for any information he could find about Preston Cole. What he found was troubling. Cole wasn't just a land developer, he was a fixer, a man who made problems disappear for people with money and influence. His company, Appalachian Resources LLC, had been involved in dozens of land acquisitions over the past 20 years, always in rural areas, always targeting properties with complicated histories or vulnerable owners. The pattern was clear. Cole would identify a target, file legal challenges to create pressure, then swoop in with a lowball offer when the owner was too exhausted or too broke to fight back. Most people sold. The few who didn't found themselves facing escalating harassment, vandalism, threats, sometimes worse. 3 former property owners had died under suspicious circumstances: heart attacks, car accidents, a hunting mishap, all ruled accidental or natural, all conveniently timed. Marcus printed everything he found and added it to a growing file. Cole was dangerous, but he wasn't invincible. He left trails. He made enemies. And somewhere in that web of transactions and threats, there had to be a weakness. But the more Marcus dug, the more questions he uncovered. Why this land? Why now? Cole had been operating in West Virginia for over 2 decades. He could have come after Samuel Cole's property at any time, when Marcus's grandfather was alive and elderly, when the land sat empty after his death, when Marcus's mother was too grief-stricken to fight back. Instead, he'd waited. Waited until Marcus came home. Waited until someone was living on the property again. Almost like he'd been watching, waiting for something to happen. The realization hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Cole knew about the bunker, maybe not the details, maybe not the exact contents, but he knew something was hidden on this land, something valuable enough to justify years of patience and careful planning. Which meant someone had talked. Someone who knew about Samuel Cole's secret had passed that information along, and now Preston Cole was trying to collect. Marcus thought about the names in the folder, the generals and senators and intelligence officials who had profited from the hidden fortune. Most of them were dead now. He'd checked, but power like that didn't disappear. It passed down through families, through networks, through the quiet machinery of influence that kept the wheels of government turning. One of them must have told Cole, or hired him, or both. The conspiracy was bigger than Marcus had imagined, and he was standing right in the middle of it, holding the keys to a fortune that powerful people would kill to possess. Father William called 3 days after the fire. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Are you safe?" "Safe enough," Marcus replied. "Daniel's been checking on me, and I've been careful." "Careful isn't enough, not with people like this." There was a pause. "Marcus, I've been making inquiries, discreetly, about your situation." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "What did you find?" "Nothing good." Father William sighed. "The attorney I mentioned, the one in Pittsburgh, he ran some preliminary searches on your grandfather's property. There are complications." "What kind of complications?" "The kind that involve classified government files and sealed court records. Whatever your grandfather was protecting, it's connected to things that powerful people want to stay hidden. My contact advised me to drop the matter entirely, said it wasn't worth the risk." Marcus closed his eyes. "So that's it? We just give up?" "I didn't say that." Father William's voice hardened. "I said my contact advised me to drop it. I didn't say I was going to listen." Despite everything, Marcus felt a smile tug at his lips. "You never were good at following orders, Father." "A character flaw, I'm told." There was warmth in the old chaplain's voice now. "Listen, Marcus, I can't come to you. My health isn't what it used to be, and the drive would be too much. But there's someone I want you to meet. A woman named Eleanor Vance. She's a journalist, investigative reporter for the Washington Chronicle. She specializes in government corruption and cover-ups." "A journalist?" Marcus frowned. "Father, I can't go public with this. Not yet. Maybe not ever." "I'm not asking you to. Eleanor is discreet. She's been working on a story about Cold War asset recovery for years. She knows things, Marcus. Things that might help you understand what you're dealing with." Marcus thought about it. A journalist was a risk. They dealt in information, and information was exactly what he was trying to protect. But Father William wouldn't steer him wrong. not about something this important. "Okay," he said finally. "Set up a meeting." Eleanor Vance was not what Marcus expected. He'd pictured someone polished, aggressive, the kind of reporter who shoved microphones in people's faces and demanded answers. Instead, the woman who met him at a diner in Charleston was quiet, watchful, with grey-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, and she carried herself with the careful economy of someone who had learned the hard way to conserve energy for the battles that mattered. "Father William speaks highly of you," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "He doesn't do that often." "He's a good man," Marcus replied. "Helped me through some dark times." "He has that gift." Eleanor ordered coffee, black, no sugar, and waited until the waitress was out of earshot before continuing. "So, you found something on your grandfather's land, something connected to the war." Marcus nodded slowly. "How much did Father William tell you?" "Enough to know this isn't a casual conversation." Eleanor leaned forward. "Let me be clear, Mr. Cole. I'm not here to steal your story or expose your secrets. I'm here because I've spent 30 years tracking a thread that keeps slipping through my fingers. Cold War asset recovery, Nazi gold, the fortunes that were supposed to be destroyed but somehow never were." Marcus's heart was pounding, but he kept his face neutral. "And you think I can help you?" "I think we can help each other." Eleanor pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "These are the names I've been able to confirm. Government officials who were involved in the recovery operations. Men who made decisions about what happened to the assets we recovered." Marcus opened the folder. The names were familiar. Most of them matched the list in his grandfather's vault. "I've spent decades trying to prove these men profited from stolen treasure," Eleanor continued. "But the evidence has always been just out of reach. Sealed files, classified operations, witnesses who died before they could talk. And you think my grandfather's property might have that evidence?" Eleanor's eyes met his. "I think your grandfather was one of the few honest men in a very dirty business, and I think he spent his life protecting something that could bring the whole house of cards down." Marcus sat back in the booth, his mind racing. This woman knew more than he'd expected, more than was comfortable, but she was also offering something valuable: context, connections, a path through the labyrinth he'd stumbled into. "If I help you," he said slowly, "what happens to the evidence? The story?" "That's up to you." Eleanor's voice was steady. "I'm a journalist, not a thief. If you have documentation, I want to see it, but I won't publish anything without your consent, and I won't reveal your identity unless you want me to." "Why should I trust you?" "Because Father William trusts me, and because I've spent my entire career fighting the same people who are trying to take what's yours." Eleanor smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "We're on the same side, Mr. Cole, whether you believe it or not." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then he made a decision. "There's a man named Preston Cole," he said. "No relation to me. He's been trying to buy my land, and when I refused, someone tried to burn down my cabin." Eleanor's expression sharpened. "Preston Cole, I know that name." "You do?" "He's a cleaner, works for people who want problems to disappear." She pulled out a notebook and started writing. "Tell me everything." Marcus talked for almost 2 hours. He told her about the bunker, the vault, the gold, the documents, everything except the exact location and the combination to the safe. Some secrets he wasn't ready to share, not yet. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across the pages. When Marcus finally finished, she sat back and let out a long breath. "This is bigger than I thought," she said quietly. "Much bigger." "Big enough to get me killed?" "Big enough to get a lot of people killed." Eleanor closed her notebook. "Mr. Cole, I need you to understand something. The men on that list, the ones still alive, they've spent decades building power and influence. They're not going to let some wounded veteran from West Virginia tear it all down." Then what am I supposed to do? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. You fight smart. You document everything. You build a case so airtight that when the time comes, there's no way they can bury it. She paused. And you find allies, people you can trust, because you're not going to win this war alone. Marcus thought about Daniel, about Father William, about the handful of people who had shown him kindness since coming home. I'm working on that. Good. Eleanor gathered her things. I'm going to dig into Preston Cole, see what connections I can find. In the meantime, be careful. These people play for keeps. I know, Marcus said. Believe me, I know. The meeting with Eleanor should have given Marcus hope. Instead, it left him feeling more isolated than ever. The conspiracy was real. The danger was real. And the only way forward was a path that could get him killed or imprisoned or worse. He drove back to Miller's Creek in a daze, barely noticing the scenery as it blurred past. By the time he reached the property, the sun was setting and the shadows were growing long. The cabin looked the same as when he'd left it, scorched but standing, wounded but not broken. Kind of like him, Marcus thought grimly. He parked the truck and walked toward the porch, his mind still churning with everything Eleanor had told him. He was so distracted that he almost missed it. A car parked at the edge of the tree line. Dark, nondescript, with tinted windows that reflected the fading light. Marcus froze. His hand moved instinctively to his hip, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Old habits. Dangerous habits. The car's door opened. Marcus tensed, ready to run or fight, but the figure that emerged wasn't what he expected. It was a woman. Young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair cut short and a face that looked vaguely familiar. She wore jeans and a leather jacket, and she moved with the careful precision of someone who had been trained. "Marcus Cole?" she called out. "Who's asking?" She stopped about 10 feet away, hands visible, posture non-threatening. "My name is Sarah Rhodes. I was General Harold Rhodes' granddaughter." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. Rhodes. That name was on the list. General Harold Rhodes, one of the men who had known about the hidden fortune, one of the men his grandfather had warned him about. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice flat. "To talk." Sarah's expression was unreadable. "My grandfather died 6 months ago. And before he died, he told me things. Things about the war, about the gold, about a man named Samuel Cole who refused to follow orders." Marcus said nothing. He was calculating distances, exits, weapons of opportunity. If this was a trap, he needed to be ready. "I'm not here to threaten you," Sarah continued, as if reading his mind. "I'm here because my grandfather spent his whole life lying, to his family, to himself, to everyone, and I'm tired of it." Tired of what? Tired of being part of something evil. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "The things he did, the people he hurt, I didn't know. Not until he was dying and the guilt started pouring out. He told me about the gold, about the cover-up, about the men who killed to keep it secret." Marcus felt something shift inside him. Suspicion, yes, but also something else. Recognition. He knew what it was like to carry the weight of other people's sins. "He told you about my grandfather?" Sarah nodded. "He said Samuel Cole was the only one with honor, the only one who refused to destroy the evidence. He said—" She hesitated. "He said if anyone deserved that fortune, it was Samuel's family, because they were the only ones who understood what it really meant." Marcus stared at her for a long moment. Every instinct screamed at him not to trust this woman, not to let down his guard, not to believe a word she said. But something in her eyes reminded him of himself. The same haunted look, the same desperate need for redemption. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want to help you bring them down." Sarah's voice was steady now, determined. "The men who profited from the stolen gold, the ones who covered up the crimes, the ones who are trying to take what's yours." She paused. including the ones who hired Preston Cole. You know who hired him? I know enough. Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a flash drive. My grandfather kept records, insurance he called it, names, dates, bank accounts, everything you'd need to prove what really happened. Marcus looked at the flash drive, then back at Sarah's face. This could be the break he needed, the evidence that would blow the whole conspiracy wide open. Or it could be a trap, a way to get close to him, to find out what he knew, to eliminate the threat before it grew too large. Why should I trust you? He asked. You shouldn't, Sarah said simply. Not yet. Trust is earned, not given. But I'm willing to earn it, if you'll let me. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and possibility. Marcus thought about his grandfather's letter, about Father William's advice, about Eleanor Vance and her 30 years of chasing shadows. Find allies, Eleanor had said. People you can trust. Maybe this was one of them, or maybe it was the biggest mistake of his life. Either way, Marcus was tired of playing defense. All right, he said finally. Let's talk. They sat on the cabin's damaged porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. Sarah told her story in fragments, each piece revealing more of the ugly truth Marcus had only glimpsed in his grandfather's documents. General Harold Rhodes had been one of the original members of the recovery unit. He'd worked alongside Samuel Cole in the years after the war, tracking down stolen assets across Europe. But unlike Samuel, Harold had seen opportunity where others saw duty. He started skimming, Sarah explained, her voice hollow. Small amounts at first, gold coins, jewelry, things that wouldn't be missed. But as the operation grew, so did his greed. And the others? They were all in on it. The whole unit, except for your grandfather. They called him the saint behind his back, said he was too stupid to see the opportunity right in front of him. Marcus clenched his jaw. He wasn't stupid. He was honest. I know. Sarah looked down at her hands. My grandfather regretted it in the end. Said the money never brought him happiness, only paranoia. He spent his whole life looking over his shoulder, waiting for someone to expose him. But no one ever did, because they protected each other, covered up the evidence, eliminated anyone who got too close to the truth. Sarah's voice hardened. Including journalists, investigators, even family members who asked too many questions. Marcus thought about the suspicious deaths he'd uncovered in his research, the convenient accidents, the sudden illnesses. How many of those had been orchestrated by the same men his grandfather had warned him about? Preston Cole, he said. Is he part of this? Sarah nodded. He's their cleanup man. Whenever there's a loose end, Cole makes it disappear. Properties, documents, people, whatever needs to be handled. And they sent him after me because they know your grandfather kept evidence. They've known for decades, but they could never find it. The bunker was too well hidden, the property too isolated. They thought the secret would die with Samuel. Sarah looked at him. Then you came home. And suddenly, someone was living on that land again. Someone who might find what they'd been looking for. Marcus felt sick. All this time, he'd thought he was the hunter. Turns out, he'd been the prey. What's on that flash drive? He asked. Everything my grandfather collected. Bank records, correspondence, photographs. Enough to prove that at least 4 surviving members of the unit profited from stolen assets. Sarah handed it to him. It's not complete. There are gaps. But combined with what your grandfather left behind. It's enough, Marcus finished. Enough to bring them down. Sarah nodded. If you're willing to take the risk. Marcus looked at the flash drive in his hand, such a small thing to hold so much power, so much potential for destruction and redemption. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. Something my grandfather told me before he died. What? The men who are still alive, the ones who've been running this operation for decades, they're planning something. A final cleanup, They want to eliminate all the evidence before they die, make sure nothing survives to incriminate their families. Marcus's blood went cold. Eliminate how? I don't know the details, but I know it's coming soon. Weeks, maybe. They're scared, Marcus, scared that the truth is finally catching up to them. Sarah met his eyes. You need to move fast, before they decide that eliminating you is the safest option. The next few days were a blur of activity. Marcus reached out to Eleanor, sharing everything Sarah had told him. The journalist was cautious. She'd been burned too many times to trust easily, but the flash drive's contents were convincing. Within 48 hours, she had verified enough of the information to confirm that Sarah's story was real. "This is it," Eleanor said during a phone call late one night. "This is the missing piece I've been looking for. With your grandfather's documents and this new evidence, we can build a case that no one can ignore." "How long?" "Weeks, maybe a month. I need to verify everything, find corroborating sources, make sure it's airtight." She paused. "Can you hold out that long?" Marcus looked out the window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, Preston Cole was watching, waiting, planning his next move. "I'll do what I have to," he said. Daniel stopped by the next morning, concern etched on his face. "You've got visitors in town," he said. "Two men checked into the motor lodge yesterday. They're asking questions about you, about the property." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make me nervous." Daniel leaned against the porch railing. "Marcus, what's going on? And don't give me that nothing crap. I've known you too long for that." Marcus hesitated. He'd been keeping Daniel at arm's length, trying to protect him from the danger that was closing in, but maybe that was wrong. Maybe isolation was exactly what his enemies wanted. "If I tell you," he said slowly, "you can't unhear it, and it might put you in danger." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm a cop, Marcus. Danger comes with the badge." So Marcus told him. Not everything, not the details of the fortune or the names in the folder, but enough. The bunker, the evidence, the conspiracy that reached back decades and up to the highest levels of power. When he finished, Daniel was silent for a long moment. "Jesus," he said finally, "you really stepped in it, didn't you?" "Yeah," Marcus almost laughed. "Yeah, I really did." "Okay." Daniel straightened, his expression hardening into something professional. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to run those two men through the system, see if anything comes up, and I'm going to start documenting everything. Every threat, every suspicious vehicle, every strange incident. If they want to play hardball, we'll give them a paper trail that leads straight to their doorstep." "Daniel—" "Don't," Daniel cut him off. "Don't try to protect me, Marcus. I've been protecting this county for 15 years. Let me do my job." Marcus looked at his old friend, the quarterback who'd become a deputy, the boy who'd become a man, and felt something loosen in his chest. Gratitude, hope, the simple relief of not being alone. "Okay," he said. "Okay, let's do this together." The days that followed were tense, electric with anticipation. Marcus continued to document the contents of the bunker, photographing every crate, every document, every bar of gold. Eleanor worked her sources, building the case that would eventually bring the conspiracy into the light. Sarah proved to be a valuable ally, her insider knowledge filling in gaps that Marcus couldn't have guessed. She knew which men were still alive, which families had inherited the blood money, which institutions had been corrupted by decades of quiet influence. "There's a senator," she told Marcus one evening as they reviewed documents in the cabin. "William Garrett from Virginia. My grandfather mentioned him specifically, said he was the linchpin, the one who kept everyone else in line." Marcus recognized the name. Garrett was a fixture of Washington politics, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, beloved by both parties as a voice of reason and moderation. "He's one of them?" "He's the leader." Sarah's voice was bitter. "Has been for 30 years. My grandfather said he was the one who gave the order to destroy the evidence, and when that didn't happen, He was the one who organized the cover-up. Can we prove it? With what's in that vault and what's on this drive? Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, I think we can. Marcus felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. They weren't just going after corrupt businessmen or dirty politicians. They were going after one of the most powerful men in Washington. If they succeeded, it would change everything. If they failed, they would disappear, just like everyone else who had tried to expose the truth. The attack came on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after Sarah's arrival. Marcus was alone in the cabin. Sarah had gone into town for supplies and Daniel was on duty when he heard the sound of engines approaching. Multiple vehicles moving fast, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. He was on his feet before the first car reached the driveway, grabbing the shotgun Daniel had left him and moving toward the back door. Instinct took over. Training. The cold, clear focus that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan. He slipped out into the night just as the front door exploded inward. Men poured into the cabin, flashlights and weapons sweeping through the empty rooms. Marcus counted 6, maybe 7, all moving with professional precision. These weren't local thugs or amateur arsonists. These were trained operators. He melted into the forest, using the terrain he'd spent weeks learning to his advantage. Every rock, every tree, every shadow became a weapon in his hands. He circled around the property, watching the men search the cabin, then spread out to sweep the grounds. They were looking for the bunker. Marcus's blood ran cold. They knew. Somehow they knew exactly what they were looking for. He had to warn the others, had to get to the bunker before they did. But first, he had to survive the night. Marcus moved through the forest like a ghost, his bad legs screaming with every step, but his mind locked into the cold clarity of combat. The men behind him were good. He could tell by the way they moved, the way they communicated with hand signals instead of radios. But they didn't know this terrain, not like he did. He'd spent weeks walking these hills, mapping the ravines and ridgelines, learning where the rocks were stable and where a misplaced step would send you tumbling into darkness. Now that knowledge was the only thing keeping him alive. He heard them crashing through the underbrush about 50 yards to his left. They'd split into teams, trying to box him in, but they were spread too thin. Marcus counted their lights, 4 beams sweeping through the trees, which meant at least 2 or 3 more had stayed at the cabin. He needed to move, needed to get to the bunker before they found the entrance. But even as the thought formed, he realized the truth. It was already too late. If they knew about the bunker, if they'd come prepared to find it, then they had information he didn't. Maybe they'd found old records. Maybe someone had talked. Maybe they'd been watching him longer than he'd realized, tracking his movements, waiting for him to lead them straight to the vault. Either way, running wasn't enough anymore. He had to fight. Marcus circled back toward the cabin, using the darkness as cover. The men searching the forest had moved past him now, their lights disappearing deeper into the trees. That left the ones at the house. 2, maybe 3, if his count was right. He approached from the east, where the scorched wall provided the deepest shadows. Through the broken window, he could see them. 2 men in tactical gear, tearing apart his grandfather's cabin with methodical efficiency. They'd already found the hidden compartment under the floorboards where Marcus kept his documents. One of them was photographing everything with a small camera. The third man stood by the door, watching. He was older than the others, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders. Marcus recognized him from Eleanor's files. Colonel James Whitfield, retired, former intelligence officer. One of the names on his grandfather's list. So they'd sent the old guard to finish the job, fitting in a way. The sins of the past come to collect their due. Marcus raised the shotgun, sighting down the barrel. He could take Whitfield now. 1 shot and the leader would be down. But that would bring the others running, and he didn't have enough ammunition to fight off 6 trained operators. He needed another approach. The propane tank sat at the corner of the cabin, half hidden by overgrown weeds. Marcus had meant to move it closer to the stove, but he'd never gotten around to it. Now he was grateful for his procrastination. He aimed low and fired. The explosion wasn't massive. Propane tanks don't detonate like in the movies, but it was enough. A burst of flame, a cloud of smoke, and suddenly the night was filled with chaos. The men inside the cabin scrambled for cover. The ones in the forest came running back, shouting into their radios. Marcus was already moving. He ran for the rock formation, his lungs burning, his leg threatening to give out with every stride. Behind him, he could hear Whitfield bellowing orders, trying to restore discipline to his scattered team. But Marcus had bought himself precious minutes. He reached the hatch and yanked it open, not bothering with stealth anymore. The stone steps swallowed him whole, and he pulled the heavy door shut behind him, engaging the internal lock his grandfather had installed decades ago. Down in the bunker, the emergency lights hummed to life. Marcus moved through the familiar space, his mind racing through options. He had food and water for weeks. The ventilation system would keep him alive. But eventually, they'd find a way in. Drill through the rock, blow the door, wait him out until he starved. He needed to end this, tonight. Marcus went to the communications console, the one he'd assumed was dead, a relic of the Cold War, and started checking connections. His grandfather had maintained this equipment for 60 years, if it still worked. Static crackled through the speaker, then a voice, faint but clear. "This is emergency frequency 773. State your identification." Marcus's heart nearly stopped. The radio was still connected to something, some network that had survived decades of neglect and government restructuring. He grabbed the microphone. "This is Marcus Cole. I'm at the Whitaker bunker, grid reference." He rattled off the coordinates from memory. "I have evidence of a conspiracy involving Cold War asset recovery. Colonel James Whitfield and armed operatives are currently attempting to breach this facility, requesting immediate assistance." Silence. Marcus counted heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Then, "Cole, this is Oversight. We've been waiting for someone to activate this channel for a very long time. Sit tight. Help is on the way." Marcus stared at the radio, unable to process what he'd just heard. Oversight. Waiting. What the hell had his grandfather been part of? The questions would have to wait. Above him, he could hear the first impacts against the hatch, someone trying to force their way through. He moved to the vault and started photographing everything. If this was the end, if Whitfield's men broke through before help arrived, at least the evidence would survive. He uploaded the images to the secure server Eleanor had set up, watching the progress bar crawl forward with agonizing slowness. 50%. 60. 70. The pounding on the hatch intensified. Marcus heard the whine of power tools. They were trying to cut through the lock. 80%. 90. The lock gave way with a screech of tortured metal. Footsteps on the stairs, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. 100%. Upload complete. Marcus set down his phone and picked up the shotgun. If this was the end, he'd face it on his feet. Whitfield appeared at the bottom of the stairs, flanked by 2 of his men. The colonel looked older up close, his face lined with decades of secrets and compromises, but his eyes were sharp, predatory, alive with triumph. "Sergeant Cole," he said almost pleasantly, "you've led us on quite a chase." "Colonel Whitfield." Marcus kept the shotgun raised. "I'd say it's a pleasure, but my grandfather taught me not to lie." Whitfield's smile flickered. "Your grandfather was a fool, a talented fool, but a fool nonetheless. He could have been wealthy beyond imagination. Instead, he chose to play guardian for treasure that was never his to protect. It wasn't yours either. No, it belonged to the dead, and the dead don't spend money." Whitfield took a step closer. "Put down the weapon, Sergeant. This doesn't have to end in blood. All I want is what's in that vault. Hand it over and you can walk away, disappear, live out your days in peace." Marcus laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the stone walls. You really expect me to believe that? After the fire? After sending armed men to hunt me like an animal? Those were unfortunate escalations. Preston Cole exceeded his authority. He's been dealt with. Dealt with? Let's just say his services are no longer required. Whitfield's smile returned. You see, Marcus, may I call you Marcus? Men like me don't survive for 60 years by being reckless. We adapt. We negotiate. We find solutions that benefit everyone. Everyone except the people you've killed. Casualties of a larger mission. Surely you understand that, Sergeant. You were a soldier. You know that sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger. Don't compare what I did to what you've done. I fought for my country. You've spent 60 years stealing from the dead and murdering anyone who got in your way. Semantics. Whitfield shrugged. The point is, we're both pragmatists. We both understand that idealism is a luxury neither of us can afford. He gestured at the vault behind Marcus. That gold has been sitting here for decades, doing nothing. In my hands it can be put to use, invested, leveraged, turned into real power that can shape the world. And in my grandfather's hands. Your grandfather wanted to give it away. Can you imagine? Hundreds of millions of dollars distributed to, what? Charities, veterans' organizations, as if that would change anything, as if kindness could repair what war destroys. Marcus stared at the old man, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not a monster exactly, just a man who had made a choice decades ago and spent his whole life justifying it. You're wrong, Marcus said quietly. About what? About all of it. Kindness does matter. Helping people matters. My grandfather understood that, even if you never could. Whitfield's patience finally cracked. Enough philosophy. Put down the weapon, or my men will put you down. Marcus looked at the two operatives flanking Whitfield, their weapons raised, their faces blank. Professionals, doing a job. He'd known men like them in the army, good soldiers who followed orders without asking questions. He thought about Rodriguez and Thompson and Diaz, about the brothers he'd lost, about the promise he'd made to himself in the dark days after the explosion, that if he survived, he'd find a way to make it mean something. This was the moment. This was the choice. Marcus lowered the shotgun. Whitfield smiled. A wise decision. Jenkins, secure the vault. Miller, restrain the sergeant. The operative named Miller moved forward, zip ties in hand. Marcus didn't resist as his wrists were bound behind his back. There was no point. Not yet. But as Miller stepped back, a sound cut through the silence of the bunker. Helicopter rotors, multiple aircraft, approaching fast. Whitfield's smile vanished. What? The radio crackled to life. Colonel James Whitfield, this is Federal Oversight Command. You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender immediately. There will be no negotiation. The color drained from Whitfield's face. That's impossible. Oversight was disbanded in '94. Oversight was never disbanded, Colonel. It was reorganized. The voice on the radio was calm, almost amused. Your activities have been monitored for quite some time. Sergeant Cole's activation of the emergency channel simply accelerated our timeline. Marcus watched as the reality of the situation crashed over Whitfield like a wave. The old man's hands began to shake. His confident posture crumbled into something small and desperate. This isn't over, Whitfield hissed. Do you have any idea who I am, who I know? I have friends in every branch of government. You have co-conspirators, Colonel, many of whom are being arrested as we speak. The radio voice hardened. This ends tonight, one way or another. Footsteps echoed down the stone stairs. Men in tactical gear, but these ones wore different insignia. Federal badges, official identification. They moved past Marcus without a word, weapons trained on Whitfield and his operatives. Colonel Whitfield, you are under arrest for conspiracy, theft of government property, and murder. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with steel-grey eyes, cuffed the old man's wrists with practiced efficiency. "You have the right to remain silent." Marcus watched as Whitfield was led up the stairs, his protests fading into the night. The other operatives followed, subdued and compliant, their professional detachment cracking under the weight of their sudden reversal of fortune. The agent who had cuffed Whitfield turned to Marcus. "Sergeant Cole, I'm Agent Victoria Chen, Federal Oversight Division. We have a lot to discuss." Marcus blinked. "Oversight? That's the second time I've heard that name tonight. What exactly is Federal Oversight?" Agent Chen smiled slightly. "A story for another time, Sergeant. For now, let's just say we're the people who clean up messes that officially don't exist." She gestured at the vault. "Your grandfather was one of our assets. Unpaid, unofficial, but invaluable. He spent 60 years protecting evidence that we couldn't secure through official channels. He never said anything. That was the point. The fewer people who knew, the safer the evidence remained." Chen's expression softened. "He was a good man, Sergeant. One of the best I never had the honor of meeting." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd been carrying since the day he found the hatch. His grandfather hadn't just been a guardian, he'd been part of something larger, something that had finally come to fruition. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now?" Chen looked around the vault, her eyes taking in the gold, the documents, the decades of carefully preserved evidence. "Now we do what your grandfather always wanted. We bring the truth into the light." The trials began 3 months later. Marcus watched most of it from a distance, preferring to let Eleanor Vance and the federal prosecutors handle the public spectacle. But he testified when they needed him, recounting his discovery of the bunker, his grandfather's letter, the attempts on his life. The evidence was overwhelming. Whitfield and 6 other surviving members of the original conspiracy were convicted on multiple counts of theft, fraud, and murder. Senator William Garrett, the linchpin Sarah had warned about, resigned in disgrace before he could be formally charged, his decades of carefully constructed respectability collapsing overnight. The media called it the biggest government scandal since Watergate. Pundits debated the implications for weeks. Historians began rewriting chapters they'd thought were settled. But for Marcus, the real work was just beginning. The fortune in the vault, $295 million in gold, currency, diamonds, and platinum, was legally transferred to a trust that Marcus established with the help of Father William and a team of non-profit attorneys. The trust had one purpose: to serve those who had served. He called it the Samuel Foundation, after the grandfather who had protected the treasure and the dream it represented. The first shelter opened in Wheeling, West Virginia, 6 months after the trials ended. It wasn't fancy, a converted warehouse with beds, showers, a cafeteria, and offices for counselors and caseworkers. But it was warm, and it was safe. And for the veterans who walked through its doors, it was a lifeline. Marcus was there on opening day, not as a donor or a figurehead, but as a volunteer. He served breakfast alongside the other workers, scrambled eggs and toast and coffee that was too weak, but nobody complained. He shook hands and listened to stories and looked into eyes that reflected his own pain back at him. "Thank you for your service," had always felt hollow to him. But this was different. This was doing something. This was making the words mean something real. More shelters followed. One in Pittsburgh, one in Columbus, one in Richmond, each one staffed by veterans, many of them former residents who had gotten back on their feet and wanted to help others do the same. But it wasn't just about beds and meals. The Samuel Foundation funded job training programs, connecting veterans with skilled trades and apprenticeships. It paid for education, covering tuition and books for anyone who wanted to learn. It provided mental health services, therapy and counseling, and the kind of patient, long-term support that the VA system was too overwhelmed to offer. And slowly, quietly, lives began to change. There was James, a Marine who had lost his legs in Fallujah and his hope somewhere in the years that followed. The foundation paid for his prosthetics, his physical therapy, his training as a computer technician. Now he ran the IT department at the Wheeling shelter, helping other veterans navigate the digital world that had left so many of them behind. There was Maria, an army medic who had come home with PTSD so severe she couldn't sleep without nightmares. The foundation connected her with a trauma specialist, funded 18 months of intensive treatment, supported her through the darkest days until she found her way back to the light. Now she was in nursing school, determined to spend her life helping others heal. There was David, a Navy veteran who had been homeless for 7 years, invisible to a world that had forgotten he existed. The foundation gave him a bed, a meal, a chance. It took time, more time than anyone expected, but eventually he found work, found housing, found himself. Last Christmas, he'd sent Marcus a card. "You saved my life. I'm going to spend the rest of it making you proud." Marcus kept that card on his desk, next to his grandfather's letter. On the hard days when the weight of everything threatened to crush him, he would read David's words and remember why he was doing this. Not for glory, not for recognition, not even for redemption. Just because it was right. Father William passed away in the foundation's 2nd year. He went quietly, in his sleep, the way he would have wanted. Marcus was at his bedside, holding the old chaplain's hand when the last breath left his body. "You did good, son," Father William had whispered near the end. "Better than I ever dreamed." Marcus had wept then, really wept for the first time since his brothers died in that distant explosion. He wept for Father William, for his grandfather, for all the people he'd lost and all the ones he was trying to save. He wept until there was nothing left, until the grief had been wrung out of him like water from a cloth. And then he got up and went back to work. The foundation grew beyond anything Marcus had imagined. Within 5 years, it operated 37 facilities across the country, serving more than 10,000 veterans annually. It had partnerships with hospitals, universities, corporations, government agencies. It had become a model for how private philanthropy could address public need. But Marcus never forgot where it came from. Never forgot the stone vault beneath the mountain, the gold bars gleaming in the emergency lights, the weight of his grandfather's trust. Every facility had a small plaque near the entrance. In memory of Samuel Cole, who believed that stolen treasure could become sacred purpose. Most visitors didn't understand what it meant. But the ones who knew, the handful of people who had been there from the beginning, would pause when they passed it, their fingers brushing the metal, remembering. Daniel became the foundation's head of security, trading his deputy's badge for a new mission. He brought the same dedication, the same quiet competence, to protecting veterans that he'd once brought to protecting Miller's Creek. And when trouble arose, as it sometimes did because not everyone appreciated what the foundation was trying to do, Daniel was there to handle it. Sarah Rhodes stayed too, despite Marcus's initial reservations. She turned out to be exactly what the foundation needed. Someone with insider knowledge of how corruption worked, how power protected itself, how to navigate the treacherous waters of politics and finance. She became the Foundation's Chief Operations Officer, transforming Marcus's vision into practical reality. "My grandfather spent his life building something evil," she told Marcus once. "Let me spend mine building something good." He couldn't argue with that. Eleanor Vance published her book 3 years after the trials, a comprehensive account of the Cold War conspiracy, the cover-up, and the unlikely veteran who had blown it wide open. She dedicated it to Samuel Cole, who knew that some truths are worth protecting, no matter the cost. The book became a bestseller. It won awards. It was optioned for a film that Marcus refused to participate in, preferring to let his grandfather's story speak for itself. But the publicity brought something unexpected. More donations, more volunteers, more veterans reaching out for help. The foundation had started with blood money, but it had become something else entirely. A movement, a mission, a promise kept. Marcus returned to Miller's Creek every year, on the anniversary of his grandfather's death. The cabin had been rebuilt, better than before, with proper insulation and a new roof and running water that actually worked. He could have lived anywhere now, could have bought a mansion or a penthouse or anything else money could provide, but he preferred the cabin, preferred the quiet of the woods, the whisper of wind through the pines, the sense of connection to the man who had made everything possible. The bunker was sealed now, the entrance hidden again beneath rock and soil and growing things. The gold was gone, liquidated carefully over years, converted into the resources that funded the foundation's work. The documents had been turned over to federal investigators, the evidence preserved for history. But Marcus still came here, to the spot where he had first discovered the hatch. He would sit on the rocks as the sun set over Miller's Ridge, watching the shadows lengthen, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. On the 10th anniversary, he brought something special, a small bronze marker, professionally engraved, meant to be placed at the site of the original bunker entrance. For those who served in silence, it read, "May their sacrifice never be forgotten." He buried it there in the rocky soil where no one would ever find it unless they knew exactly where to look. A secret monument to a secret mission, honoring men who had never received public recognition for what they'd done. His grandfather, Father William, all the veterans who had passed through the foundation's doors, some of them now gone, all of them remembered. Marcus knelt in the dirt for a long time, his bad leg aching, his eyes burning with tears that no longer shamed him. He had learned over the years that strength wasn't about suppressing emotion. It was about feeling everything and choosing to move forward anyway. "I hope I made you proud, Grandad," he whispered. "I hope it was enough." The wind stirred through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and the first hint of autumn chill. It felt, for just a moment, like an answer. That night, Marcus sat on the rebuilt porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. His phone buzzed with messages from Foundation staff, updates on new programs, requests for guidance, the constant hum of an organization that had taken on a life of its own. He answered them all, because that was the job now. Not fighting wars, not uncovering conspiracies, but the quiet daily work of helping people rebuild their lives. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was meaningful in a way that nothing else had ever been. Daniel's truck appeared on the driveway around 8, headlights cutting through the darkness. His old friend climbed out with a 6-pack of beer and a bag of sandwiches from the diner in town. "Figured you might be hungry," Daniel said, settling into the other chair. "You always forget to eat when you come out here." "Thanks." Marcus accepted a beer, twisting off the cap. "How's everything at the Wheeling facility?" "Good. We had 23 new intakes last month. Maria's counseling program is really taking off. She's got a waiting list now." "That's amazing." "Yeah." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You know, sometimes I still can't believe any of this is real. 10 years ago you were a broken-down vet living in a falling-apart cabin, and I was a small-town deputy who'd never done anything that mattered. Now look at us." Marcus smiled. "We got lucky." "Nah." Daniel shook his head. "Luck is finding $20 in your old jacket. What you did, what you built, that's something else. That's purpose." They sat in silence for a while, drinking their beers, listening to the sounds of the forest. The same sounds Marcus had heard on his first night back in Miller's Creek, when he'd thought he had nothing left to live for. How wrong he had been. "You ever regret it?" Daniel asked eventually. "The money, I mean. You could have kept it, could have lived like a king for the rest of your life." Marcus thought about it, really thought, the way he'd thought about it dozens of times over the years. "No," he said finally. "The money was never mine. It was always just borrowed. My job was to figure out what it was supposed to become." And this is what it was supposed to become? Shelters and programs and helping a bunch of strangers you'll never meet? They're not strangers. Marcus turned to look at his friend. They're brothers and sisters, every single one of them. We all served, we all sacrificed, we all came home to a world that didn't know what to do with us. He paused. This is what the money was supposed to become. A way of saying, you matter. You're not alone. Someone gives a damn. Daniel nodded slowly. Your grandfather would be proud. I hope so. Marcus looked up at the stars, impossibly distant, impossibly bright. I really hope so. The foundation continued to grow in the years that followed. New facilities opened across the country, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Miami, in Seattle. The model expanded to include not just veterans, but their families, recognizing that the wounds of war rippled outward, touching everyone connected to those who served. Marcus stepped back from day-to-day operations eventually, trusting Sarah and the team he'd built to carry the mission forward. But he never stopped working, never stopped showing up at shelters to serve meals and listen to stories and remind himself why all of it mattered. He got married in his late 40s to a woman named Rachel who ran the Foundation's mental health division. She understood him in ways that most people couldn't. Understood the nightmares that still came sometimes, the guilt that never fully went away, the weight of responsibility that he would carry until his last breath. They had a daughter, a fierce little girl they named Grace. Marcus taught her about her great-great-grandfather, about the war and the gold and the choice that had changed everything. He wanted her to understand that wealth wasn't about what you possessed. It was about what you did with what you had. You have to help people, Daddy, she asked him once when she was 5 years old and still figuring out how the world worked. I don't have to, Marcus told her, lifting her onto his lap. I get to. There's a difference. Grace thought about that for a while. Then she nodded with the solemn certainty that only children possess. Okay, she said. Then I want to help people too. Marcus hugged her tight and felt for just a moment like everything had been worth it. All the pain, all the struggle, all the fear and doubt and darkness. It had led here to this little girl who already understood what so many adults never learned. Kindness mattered, compassion mattered, showing up for the people who needed you, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. That was what gave life meaning. The fortune that had started as blood money, stolen from the dead, hoarded by the corrupt, had been transformed into something else entirely. Not a monument to greed, but a testament to grace. Not a secret to be buried, but a light to be shared. And Marcus Cole, the broken veteran who had come home with nothing, had found something more valuable than gold. He had found purpose. He had found family. He had found the courage to believe that even the darkest chapters could lead to dawn. The stone vault beneath the mountain was empty now, but its legacy lived on in every veteran who found shelter, every family that found hope, every life that was saved because someone had chosen to care. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the pines and the stars blazed overhead, Marcus would sit on his grandfather's porch and remember. He would remember the hatch in the rock, the stairs descending into darkness, the gold bars gleaming in the emergency lights. He would remember the letter, the words that had set everything in motion. You must use it for good. And he would smile because he had. Against all odds, against every obstacle, he had taken something meant for destruction and turned it into salvation. Anyone can rise from ruin if they're brave enough to believe that broken things still have purpose, and wounded hearts can still change the world. As the first light of dawn crept over the West Virginia hills, Marcus Cole closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of morning, birds singing, wind stirring, the distant laughter of his daughter waking in the house behind him. He had walked through fire and shadow to reach this place, this moment, this peace. The injured veteran who had found a forgotten bunker, who had discovered a fortune meant to destroy him, had chosen a different path. He had chosen to build instead of hoard, to heal instead of hide, to transform blood money into sacred purpose. And in doing so, he had proven what his grandfather had always believed, that even the darkest legacy could become light if placed in the right hands. Because for Marcus, and for the thousands of veterans whose lives would never be the same, the story wasn't about the money. It was about what we do when fortune finds us. It was about choosing hope over fear, service over selfishness, love over everything that tries to tear us apart. It was about remembering that we are never truly alone, that someone, somewhere, is always waiting to help us rise. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of courage, sacrifice, and the moments that change everything. Click now to keep the journey going, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that broken things still deserve to shine.